I'm Nora Trapp. I'm an engineer and applied cryptographer here at the Applied Social Media Lab at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center. My work primarily here revolves around two things. One is sort of reclaiming digital identity tools in ways that can be used for things like supporting and making safer tools for whistleblowers and dissidents. But I also am very focused on making end-to-end encryption more available broadly across a lot of different application spaces, which builds on a lot of my past career, which involved working at Signal for a number of years and helping shape up a lot of what you see when you use that application today and the security protections that exist within Signal. And yeah, ultimately, like my passion in my work is around human rights and making sure that everyone has access to privacy and security.
Nice. We heard that Signal is already used post-quantum cryptography.
Yes, that's correct. It's, I would say, not a complete solution, but Signal is in part starting to delve into post-quantum cryptography for the key exchange portion of the protocol. But there's more work to be done. There's a number of different ways in which things are encrypted within Signal, and some more pieces need to be upgraded.
Right. And did you use, I mean, maybe you cannot tell us, but
Yeah.
let me ask if you use any of the NIST algorithms?
Yeah, Signal is using Kyber, which was one of the, I think, the first thing that NIST standardized upon. But importantly, NIST is standardizing on a number of things because I think one of the most important things to recognize as we're sort of coming up with ways to deal with these quantum computers in the cryptographic space is that the algorithms that we're coming up with now are really based on theory and what we think and how we think these things might work. But it's possible in a year or two the theory that we have now might prove to be incorrect. And so we need to be able to like iterate and rapidly advance on those. And so NIST put out a number of different things that have been standardized now. I think they're at 3, but they're still looking for more that are sort of like differing in the ways and the types of math that they're built on top of. And Signal is also trying to similarly have some diversity. So not entirely leaning into just relying on these post-quantum tools, but making sure that the standard elliptic curve cryptography is there as a fallback protection if some kind of problem is found in the quantum.
Okay, so you still trust more the elliptic curve than the NIST solutions?
Yes, and in some ways, those techniques have much longer history and been proved out. But we know that they're not going to be protecting us forever. Right. And so I think like the approach that we've taken with Signal was to use both so that it's not you're getting a protection of one or the other, but rather someone would have to break both the like Kyber post-quantum protection as well as the elliptic curve protection. So if a vulnerability is found in Kyber, Signal messages will still be protected. If a vulnerability was found for some reason in the elliptic curve cryptography that Signal is using, the messages would still be protected by Kyber. And it'll be easy to swap in other algorithms if we find out that like Kyber, for example, is not the right thing for the future.
Sure. Well, we know quite a bit about the NIST efforts and a few of the algorithms, which are probably the expert here anyway. And I let them asking more on the technical parts. I just have 2 other questions that I usually have for everyone in these interviews. Well, the point is, if it's not NIST, because NIST is like the United States government, do you envision any other organization that is international and could work together to find or prototype new forms of cryptography?
Yeah, I think it's a really valuable question to think about where these standards are coming from. And I think there could be value in a global effort to defining some degree of standard, but I think it's important that some of what NIST has done and some of what NIST has modeled in making sure these standards are flexible and adaptable, because these are all things that we're developing very quickly and based on theory and have the potential to break, that anything that gets put out at a global scale, any kind of like consortium or regulatory body to push for quantum protections at a global scale, is willing to not just be like, okay, we're going to adopt this one thing, but wanting to actually do that research and do that ongoing research to make sure that our data is protected and
Yeah.
secure.
And the other classic annoying question is when do you expect that a quantum computer,
Sure.
algorithms, or anyone out there will be able to break the current public encryption scheme?
Yeah. So I think in some ways, you hear stories in the news all the time of like, oh, Google's got this new quantum computer, but it's like, they can only handle just like a few qubits, and it's not actually the thing that is going to break the cryptography that we rely on right now. I think the consensus seems to be mostly pointing to like around a decade. I'm not, an expert in developing quantum computers, but I tend to sort of lean into that expectation that things will be here in about a decade. But we can't wait until then. Like, we have to be protecting our data now, because anything we're encrypting now, anything we're sharing now, anything we've shared over the last many years since the internet has become ubiquitous and everyone's data has been really relying on these more not quantum proof encryption technologies, is vulnerable to these quantum computers. And there are governments and agencies that have been collecting that data. And
Yeah, 10 years is a minute. After all, it's not that far
absolutely,
away.
absolutely.
The wrapping is a really interesting and I think like a very smart approach. And I know you described that that's a technique applied at Signal, but from the broader perspective outside of that piece of software and the secure communications network it provides, bigger picture. Wrapping it seems like a smart approach, and if the cost of the performance of whatever system or the expense of doing the additional wrapping is not so onerous that it can't be achieved, it seems smart to say, let's just multiply the number of things or add more things that have to be broken apart in order to get at this. And does that seem to be getting uptake? Is that something you see elsewhere?
It is. Yeah, I mean, so you're right to like call out the performance characteristics of this.
Yeah.
There's definitely a cost to doing that. The way in which Signal is doing this right now is sort of in the initial exchange when you're setting up a session to share your messages. And so it's a thing that is happening usually one time per person you're connecting with. And so having a fair amount of additional cost there is affordable. There's going to be a lot of applications where that's maybe not affordable, but it has been an approach that I have seen being adopted in some other places. So I think Apple has been doing a little bit in their iMessage implementation of post-quantum that similarly follows that track.
Cool. And the notion of doing the key exchange and having that be the heavier effort falls back on the symmetric encryption is not thought. That's not thought to be at such a risk. And your personal perspective on it is welcome because...
So, the symmetric encryption, things like AES, which Signal heavily relies upon, right now, expert consensus is that there is some risk from quantum computing. There is the potential that the keys for those can be broken more quickly than they can be with silica computers, but it's not the same degree as like the risks of Shor's algorithm to RSA. And so protecting against those is, I think, something that we have to be prepared for, especially because we're sort of like envisioning this 10-year mark where we have quantum computers that, okay, they can break through things like RSA and maybe some of these elliptic curve cryptography techniques, but quantum computers are going to continue to improve and continue to get more powerful, things like Moore's law probably will similarly apply. And so we can't just be complacent with, the short Band-Aid solutions that we're making now.
Yeah, that makes sense. And if it's a reduction in the amount of time, but it's not a dramatic reduction, then higher grades of even AES as a technique, but just with larger key sizes, might hold. But then there may be a quantum leap in quantum computing again, right? That's there's all kinds of stuff out ahead. I think that's the only appropriate approach, is to say it's going to keep evolving. And okay.
More than technical questions. I was fascinated I honestly didn't know that this work was going on, and when I looked it up, I was fascinated by what the kind of projects that were going on here. And you mentioned in your introduction that your passion came from making the internet safe for everyone. And this is kind of a standard question that you probably have heard from me in many interviews. I work in finance, insurance, and and my passion is actually making finance and insurance accessible to everyone, and as a resilience measure for climate change and everything. And one thing that I am concerned about is that relies heavily on technology and digital fund transfers, which is necessary to make it easily accessible to most of the vulnerable communities. And I often wonder about the security that's around those. Do you have any idea about what's being used, what the vulnerabilities are, and what's being done?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a very broad question.
Yes.
So a lot of my work here at Berkman Klein Center is around digital identity, which very much ties into the space that you're describing. And particular, when you're doing like these financial operations and banking operations, you have to be able to validate your identity and verify who you are so you can safely make these transactions. And so there are a number of different tools and techniques, but not really any good standards around ways in which that identity verification actually happens. So I'm sure you've probably experienced and perhaps have implemented in some of the products that you support some of these flows where like you have to scan pictures of your photo ID, you have to take a bunch of selfies of your face, and all of these things get uploaded in a way that's actually not very privacy preserving and doesn't actually do a great job at validating who you are to begin with. These tools have been exposed in a number of different spaces. For example, I think it was DoorDash recently, so they would have the similar sort of validation for their drivers. They decided to add profile pictures for their drivers recently. And they just updated all of their drivers to automatically have profile pictures that was the selfies that they took for that validation process, which you can imagine for a lot of these drivers was like, I didn't know you were storing that. This is like really invasive. I was not taking this as a photo that I wanted to be shown to the world or anyone to see. And so there are like those small privacy violations there, but there are also some much potentially deeper ones where if I'm sharing this photo of my ID with a banking organization, maybe you need to know like my real legal name, you need to know my address, but there's a lot of things that exist on a government issued ID that you don't necessarily need to know. And so the work that I'm doing here in part is around how can that information be shared with organizations like banks, but also with social media platforms or with, for example, an investigative journalist. If I want to be able to say, hey, I work for this organization, but I don't want to tell you anything else about who I am, so that you can know that I am like a real source that you're talking to, and you can feel safe talking to this source without disclosing any other information about you. And so this is using things like anonymous credentials, which is a cryptographic technique to be able to basically generate a form of like token that allows you to prove something about yourself without having to actually reveal who you are. And that's all built on top of something called zero knowledge proofs, which allows you to share many things with a party and prove that you know something, and you can validate that you have a piece of information without having to necessarily be like, here's my whole ID.
So connecting that to like cryptography and current encryption methods, which may or may not be used in services that reach these communities. Do you think there is I'd say like much higher risk to those communities and those operations with the possibility of quantum computing being able to break this the current methods?
Yeah, I mean, quantum computing is a risk to
Yes,
everyone.
yes.
You know, there was a time where people sharing secrets were limited to maybe like government agencies using ciphers, or particular people who had specific things to hide, and then there were like people breaking those codes. But since the internet has become ubiquitous, we all are every day transferring data, whether it's financial information like you're talking about, or medical information, or even just like the messages that we're exchanging with friends and family, not just in Signal, but in many, many different platforms. And so all of this is very, very relevant and necessary to be protected from quantum computers.
Yeah. I think my concern is usually around because the larger organizations, the bigger banks, they're probably, hopefully, already preparing to implement newer cryptography methods, the quantum safe cryptography. But I don't think the smaller institutions are even aware. So I kind of feel like the risk is a bit skewed. It might not be. Yes, everyone's at risk with quantum algorithms, but I feel like there is a bit of a skew there.
It's absolutely harder for some of those organizations to have the resources to adopt these technologies. And I do think that's a place in which standardization and having some degree of more global regulation around this could help us move forward to a point where the tools and techniques necessary for even these smaller organizations to adopt and protect themselves against this will be available. But I don't know that it's ever going to be just there are off-the-shelf things that any financial institution can use, because unfortunately, every one of these financial institutions has done things in slightly their own way. Maybe there's some overlap, but there's going to have to be some work put into fixing every single one of these problem spaces, and we don't have a lot of time to do that work.
What would you do if tomorrow the encryption scheme is broken? I mean, what would be the first thing? I mean, what would happen?
Yeah, I mean, that's a terrifying thought, right? But I think in general, education is one of the biggest things that we can be doing to make sure the public is broadly aware of the risk here. And so if that day comes when quantum computing is able to break our encryption schemes, whether that's tomorrow and 10 years from now, people are aware that the things that they're transmitting now, the platforms that they're communicating on now, are not protected against that. And so, you have this understanding that even if you're using something that is ostensibly end-to-end encrypted, that data that you're transmitting has a vulnerability. You can control and prepare what you're sharing and what you're sending across those platforms. Obviously, that can't protect everything you've ever shared since. I don't have a clear-cut answer for what people do with all of that potential risk that already exists behind them, because it differs for every single person. Every single person's risk is different in this scenario. For me personally, there's not a lot you can do there if suddenly tomorrow all of our encryption was broken, except stop relying on that encryption and continuing to research better ways to exchange private information and pushing for platforms to start adopting that.
Yeah.
But I hope that that's not the reality that we face.
Yeah, the catch-22 situation is that you want to make everyone aware that encryption is broken, but at the same time, by saying so, you might create some damage. I mean, also depending if you make people just aware of it or you release the way you have done it, right? Those are two things. But then it stays secret the way things can be broken. But maybe that's better.
Well, I think there's certainly an argument to be made there, but in general, my belief is security through obscurity is not really security. If someone has produced a quantum computer that can break the encryption that we are using today, then I would rather know about it. I would rather the world be aware of that, because we don't know who has access to that. And even just one person having access to that, or one government, or one agency somewhere, that is a huge risk to the entire population of our planet. And so I don't think trying to keep that under wraps necessarily protects anyone more than sort of in name only. Ultimately, you're just sort of setting yourself up for more risk, feeling like you are protected when you aren't. And I think that's a slippery slope.
If someone figure how to break encryption with a quantum computer, a formula, whatsoever, then they may also try to own that particular technology or algorithms. And that is something they can or they cannot. Could they patent it? Can we force them to release it in the public domain? What do you think?
I mean, it's absolutely possible for someone to own a piece of technology. Do I believe that should be possible? Is it a very different question? I am a strong supporter of free and open source technologies, and so I would like to imagine a world where whether it's the discovery or development of a quantum computer or these post-quantum encryption techniques, that all of these things would be available to everyone. I don't know that there is really a reality under this capitalist society that we currently live in which that could really be strongly enforced.
Internet neutrality, right?
Net neutrality, yeah.
That it actually worked in the US a little bit, right? There's some regulations.
It's worked. I think there's certainly been pushback against it, but for the most part, it feels like there has been consensus amongst both the companies and the nonprofits and the government that it is in all of our benefit to have a free and open internet. That said, if you look back to how some of these technologies developed, a lot of cryptographic tools were developed by government agencies and by things like for-profit companies. A lot of them were developed in open ways as well and made freely available to everyone. So I think there is definitely a reality in which we look to a post-quantum future where encryption is available to specific parties and specific groups of people. I think that would be really unfortunate. I think there's maybe some degree of work legislation and regulation could do to help make that not the reality we're moving forward to, similar to some of the net neutrality work that has happened. But we have to be very careful when regulating things around encryption and privacy spaces too, because there's a lot of hazard to sort of regulating yourself into a way where it's not actually possible to innovate any longer. It's not possible. Rather than making sure this thing is accessible to everyone, you can get into a world where you've regulated it to a point where it's accessible to no one except the people who just don't want to follow the laws. And I don't think that's a future that I would like to see either.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends if the law is fair for everyone or not, as only protecting corporations. We can imagine how to build a post-quantum internet, or let's say a layer that I imagine more software-based than hardware-based, although we might also need to change all the hardware at one point. I mean, I know this is a difficult question, like how do we re-engineer the whole internet? But there might be maybe a new protocol that can be very easily and very quickly implemented.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky question, right? I think in a lot of ways, adapting existing protocols is the fastest way that we can bring the internet up to speed for a post-quantum future. And so like the work that is going into, for example, updating TLS to support post-quantum encryption is going to start protecting a lot of things. You know, all of the websites we browse, things like the medical information you're browsing when you're going to your doctor's website, and even a lot of this financial information when you're going to banking websites. And so I think thinking about an alternative where you're trying to roll out an entirely new network feels to me like it may be a much heavier lift, because even just rolling out to a world where we had encryption for everyone, where we had SSL and TLS that was freely available and accessible to everyone and for every website and became the norm, took pretty much a decade or more. I don't think we have that time. I mean, I'm pretty sure we don't have that period of time to roll out an entirely new, quantum layer of the internet.
Yeah, and that is only the open internet, because then there is all the question about digital identities, and then there is all the wallets, crypto wallets, and then there are all the data centers, right?
Yeah, of course.
All the data is stored in data centers that are secured by one key or a few keys that are all possibly broken. So and then it's not just one protocol. I would say it's probably. I mean, if we could update the RSA, probably that would be the quickest.
I mean, yeah, sure. Finding a fix to RSA would solve a lot of problems, but RSA is also not being used by a lot of things. It's like Signal is not using RSA, for example. It's using elliptic curve cryptography instead. But and there's been like a general move away from RSA in a lot of the cryptographic community, but a lot of legacy systems are based on it. So that would be like a fast path to fixing a number of things. But of course, yeah, there's many layers of things, data centers, infrastructure, many places that need protection, and dealing with something like TLS is just like one piece of the puzzle. There's a lot of pieces to that puzzle, and there's certainly argument for being like, could we just create a whole new puzzle where we don't have to worry about fixing all these pieces, but you still have to find some way to bring all of those pieces into that new world. Yeah. And so I think you face a lot of the same traction, and in some ways it's going to be like even harder.
Yeah, on the elliptic curve, she's actually doing some work on that.
Yeah.
And yours, it was very interesting that you said the RSA is not that actually implemented anymore, or it's there, but
it's used by to be fair, it's used by a lot of people.
It's still something.
Yeah.
But the elliptic curve is still based on some principle of the RSA.
Absolutely.
So if those principles are broken, then also
the elliptic curve cryptography totally faces the same vulnerabilities. I just don't know that a fix to RSA necessarily would be a fix to the elliptic curve cryptography.
The fix maybe that we're talking about is the fact that most of cryptography today is based on that very fundamental mathematical function of the two prime numbers.
Yes.
And maybe that's where we need a replacement, but I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, so I think the concern is that if there is a vulnerability in the RSA, it could easily be translated into a vulnerability in the elliptic curves.
Yeah, absolutely.
So even though elliptic curves are considered to be more superior or more preferred now like people moving away from RSA to elliptic curves. Does that really safeguard?
Yeah.
Does that really
No.
provide the security?
No. It's not a protection when it comes to anything in the quantum world. And I think, that when you think about how do we move away from these like prime number problems, that's what things like Kyber and like this lattice mathematics is trying to do, and coming up with these new mathematical algorithms that allow us to have these one-way functions that are things that we don't think quantum computers can break. So I think in essence we're the community is already trying to develop these things that can replace something like RSA, but maybe there's a bridge to how do you patch this back into RSA and allow people to sort of more quickly adopt it that hasn't been explored.
Yeah, I think the key issue, like the practical concern, is that you can come up with a fix theoretically, but it may not be a fix, like it may not be useful if you cannot implement it quickly enough with the infrastructure we currently have. If it's completely incompatible with the infrastructure we have, then it's going to take longer to apply the fix then.
Yeah. That's why I'm thinking that maybe a quick fix or a quick patch could be just the way the keys are created. That the keys, I mean, everything stays as it is, but it's just that the keys are not created by factoring prime numbers. It's something else, and that would be a quick fix. I mean, I don't know how I meant
I don't know. I don't know enough about it. Maybe you have some idea, but I don't know enough about cryptography to provide like an alternative solution.
This is essentially like
change the key on the lock.
That's essentially what things like Kyber are aiming to do. So I think it's just like a question of maybe there's a way you can make those keys fit in the old locks, right? And like, I don't know. That's like post-quantum cryptography is not like my primary area of expertise, but it's something that I think every cryptographer has to be aware of, and so I think there is definitely room to research in that direction. And
nice. Actually, you are probably the only one we're interviewing that went through this experience of upgrading a very present platform like Signal with millions of users using it and upgrading it. So how was your experience? Was it quick? Did you have many people working on it? Or?
Yeah. So I worked on this to some degree while I was at Signal, and then so it's taken a number of years to actually get to that point that it's able to be rolled out. There's probably been close to at least a dozen researchers that have contributed to the work on getting the protocol, just the key exchange portion of the protocol, up to date for post-quantum computers. And so it's a lengthy process. A lot of that process is like discussing how do you want to do this? Do we want to just sort of like revise the existing protocol, or do we want to come up with like an entirely new protocol that solves for this in a different way, and then have a migration plan from one protocol to another? Most of my effort was involved in thinking through like sort of an entirely new iteration of the Signal protocol that would be from the outset ready for quantum computing. And the approach that Signal ultimately ended up taking is a little more conservative one, where just the key exchange is now protected, and it's built in a way that is drop-in replacement for the existing key exchange. And even so, after years of research and development, it's also months and months and months before you can roll that out, because all the clients and platforms have to get up to date and be capable of handling that before you can actually start exchanging those keys. Because if the person you're sending to is not running a version of an application or aware of that new protocol, then there's no way you can have this new post-quantum exchange with them.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, in fact, we are also considering that upgrade is not only on the software side, but actually the hardware side, because a lot of hardware in the internet platforms, infrastructures have are based on encryption that might not work in the future. Could be like I don't know, I guess you're not a hardware person, but definitely the switches, the backbones, they have microchips. Actually, we have also infrastructure that's mostly based on Cisco servers and so on. So those are all like upgrades that we need to.
Absolutely not my area of expertise. But yeah, I mean, there is certainly, when you start thinking about the infrastructure, a lot of places where these types of security come in, whether it's even just as simple as like the logins and passwords that's protecting the access to the switches that protect the data centers, that protect all of that vulnerable data that's living in that data center. Like there's many layers of things that certainly need to be updated.
And so, last question, I would say, we don't want to keep you forever. Do you have any other ethical concerns in this area? I mean, you don't work much in policy, right?
My work is, I would say not directly involved in policy.
Okay.
Yeah.
By any ethical concerns, since you are interested in human rights in any case?
Yeah. I will say that often the policy that is created around these sorts of things, around encryption, around technology in general, does not, one, center any form of technologists that actually are aware and understand how these things work. And so I think it's important for technologists and policymakers to be working hand in hand. That's something that at Berkman Center, we're very adept at sort of making happen, and something that I'm hopeful that I can be more involved in those processes in the future. But also, these policies often are not inclusive and representative of everyone. And so I think it's very easy for us to like legislate a way in which encryption should be used, or going back to like the digital identity space, which is something that I'm working in much more right now. There's work right now to legislate around how digital identity information could be used for things like child safety and protecting users as they're accessing platforms and making them verify their ages. But it's very easy to create legislation in these spaces that doesn't realize things like not everyone even has access to a government ID. Not everyone has access to a phone that is powerful enough to perhaps run some of these quantum algorithms. So like all of these things, you have to be thinking about the breadth of technology and policy and infrastructure that is in place, and how different people have access to different things.
Equality.
Equality, yeah, for sure.
Yes, yes. And in the area of human rights, since you are quite a lot invested in protecting the privacy of whistleblowers, but also activists and so on.
Yeah.
I mean, I know this obvious question, but in a post-quantum post-cryptography future, I mean, what would that mean?
You know,
consider we don't know if actually China or even the NSA is already able to break those formal encryptions.
I'll say that like most of my human rights work, whether it's been in supporting dissidents in Hong Kong or in the Middle East or in the United States, in each of those scenarios, it's usually not you're trying to hide from everyone. There's usually a specific target that you're trying to organize against or hide information from. So like I worked a lot with women in Iran who were trying to organize protests and needed to enable communication networks for them to be able to protest as the government was censoring internet access. And so like in that specific scenario, your adversary is not everyone. You can have a specific threat model where you're thinking about just who is the person that you're worried about for your specific human rights issue. Working with women in Afghanistan when the Taliban came back in, similarly, their threat model was like Taliban inspecting their devices as they were crossing borders or trying to leave the country and trying to find refuge in other countries. They're not worried about quantum encryption. They're not worried about China potentially having a quantum computer. They're just worried about how do I hide things on my phone so that when someone physically takes my device, they're not seeing these things. So I think there is a lot of application for encryption and security protections and educating people in these dire situations on how to use them well, as long as you are able to define what the threats are that they're trying to protect against. Will it become harder? Probably. But it will still be useful for people in certain situations.